This video shows you how you can design a form in WebForms that automatically sends an email. With just a few lines of code that call our email API, you can, for example, design a form that automatically sends an email notification every time a form is submitted. The instructions in this video assume that you are proficient in the basics of WebForms form design. If you aren't proficient in form design basics, watch the introductory video called WebForms, Designing a Form. In this video, I'll show you the code that calls the email API, but before I do that, let's look at this very simple form I designed that sends an email. You probably wouldn't ever need to design such a form. Instead, this form is to show the API parameters on screen so that I can illustrate how the API works. There is, though, one practical form design technique you'll want to remember, which is how to configure a submit button in the designer to integrate with the API. I'll show you how to do that now. First, since the submit button is going to integrate with code, we need to select the programming language for this form to be Visual Basic. Under the Developer tab, click Language. Then select the programming language. Set the project location for Visual Basic code to what is shown here: C, RJS WebForms, Forms, Projects. Now, with the coding language set, click the cursor on the form where you want to add a submit button. Then under the Home tab in the Controls area, click Button. Right-click the button and go to its properties. Make it a Submit button. Then go to Submit Options. Choose to allow users to submit this form. Go to the Advanced Settings. In most production forms, you'd probably want the form to close after a user clicks Submit. But in this example, we're going to leave the form open so we can see the API in action. Then go up here and choose Perform Custom Action Using Code. Now the Submit button is configured in the designer. The next thing to do is insert the code that calls the email API. To insert the code that calls the API, we first need to add the API to the project. In the code editor, up here in the Project Explorer, click Show All Files. Right-click References and choose Add Reference. Go to the Browse tab. And then go to C, RJS WebForms, Forms, DLLs. Then choose RJS WebForms Integration API.dll. If you don't have the DLL installed on your WebForms server yet, just contact RJS Software to get a copy of it. Now, click formcode.vb. Formcode.vb is a kind of code module known as a code behind, because it holds all the custom code that is behind the visual design of the form. It is in the code behind where you can write all custom code for this form. To include the email API functionality, I add 2 lines here. This sRoot node is an abstraction of how the fields are called in an XML file. Essentially, it shortens what you have to type when working with field names. The second line brings in the functionality of the custom API code. Down here, you can see that from having configured the Submit button in the designer, this onSubmitRequest event gets created. So in this part of the code, a user has just clicked the Submit button. Now I'm going to enter the few lines of code that call the API so an email gets sent after the Submit button is clicked. This line sets the error message to blank. This line is the actual call to the API. In the API itself, there's a function called WFSendMail. And I'll show you all the parameters that can be passed to this function. It knows it needs an SMTP hostname. Here's the from email address, the to email address. It needs a subject, and so forth. This syntax refers to the SMTP server field in the simple form I showed you at the beginning of this video. Of course, in a production form, for many companies, this information would get passed in the background, not through the form itself. This line displays whether the sending of the email passed or failed. And if there was an error, the API returns the last error message. So now that you've been introduced to the few lines of code that call this API, let's test the API in debug mode. I'll put a breakpoint here and start debugging. We'll get a preview of our form. I'll fill in the to and from addresses. Then click Submit. The code stops at the breakpoint, and I'll press F10 to step through the code. Then if I hover up here, we can see that the code was successful. And here's a look at the form so we can see what the error message displays, which is that the form was submitted successfully. And of course, there's the test email showing up in my inbox. So if you need an email to get sent for confirmation or any other reason after a user submits a form, all it takes is our email API and a few lines of code.